Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. Currently, I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS Navigators are online throughout today's program, answering questions and connecting you to resources. This past October, the European Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis held its annual conference, known as the ECTRIMS Congress. Taking place in Amsterdam this year, the world's largest MS research conference attracted over 8,700 attendees from more than 100 different countries, all anxious to hear 200 expert speakers present the very latest discoveries in MS research. Joining us to discuss some of the truly exciting advances in MS research that are taking place today, and to discuss what this progress means for people affected by MS, is the Executive Vice President of Research at the National MS Society, Dr. Bruce Bebo. Welcome, Dr. Bebo, and thanks for joining us today.
Hi, John. Good to be with you.
The first research presentation I'd like to get into is the large genetic study that suggests 2 gene variations contribute to more serious disease. Can you tell us about this trial and how it's different from other studies that have explored the genetic risk of developing MS?
Sure, happy to. So maybe you and many of you are aware that there are more than 200 genetic variants that have been identified to contribute to the risk of MS. But the genetic underpinnings of disease severity in MS has until recently, really, until this study, remained poorly understood. So to try to answer this question, one of our society-funded clinical research fellows, Dr. Adil Harood, and the colleagues at the International MS Genetics Consortium evaluated the genetic sequencing data from over 12,000 people with MS. Now, these sequences were collected from 21 different clinical centers in North America, Europe, and Australia, and they reported the results, as you mentioned, in October in Amsterdam. So they queried almost 8 million different genetic variants, and they found 2 variants to be associated with the risk for MS progression. Important to note that neither of those 2 variants have been identified or been linked to the risk of MS. We're just talking about progression and severity of MS. So what the researchers found that people in the study, if they had 2 copies of the lead severity variant, tended to accrue disability a lot faster than people that didn't have the variant. So for example, these people experienced a 24-week confirmed disability worsening sooner than if they didn't have the variant. Maybe another way to illustrate is that individuals that had 2 copies of this variant required the use of an aid for walking short distances almost 4 years earlier than people who did not have 2 copies of this variant. You mentioned there was two variants, so there were similar associations observed for a second variant. So if you and people in this study carrying at least 1 copy of this variant needed a walking aid on average 2.2 years earlier than those without. So those are significant findings. I would add another twist, and so the investigators looked at autopsied brain tissue from 290 people with MS, and they found that lead variant was linked to an almost 2-fold higher rate of demyelination, right? So that's the loss of myelin, the protective substance surrounding nerve cells that's progressively lost in MS. And they also had about twice as many lesions or areas in the central nervous system that are damaged. It's interesting to note that both of these variants, they're not genes in them themselves, but they occur in areas that regulate other genes. So when you look to see, well, what genes could they be regulating? It looks like most of them are probably genes that are expressed by oligodendrocytes. Those are the cells, or oligos, a little easier to say. So those are the cells that actually make myelin. They're the cells that are the subject of attack by the immune system in MS. And just to point out again, this contrasts with most of the genes in the studies linked to MS risk, which are almost exclusively found in immune cells. So the genes that confer risk seem to be driving the immune responses. The genes that are so far that have been discovered that seem to be driving severity and progression are found expressed in the central nervous system.
And what does this new information mean for people who are living with MS?
Yeah, so I think the excitement here is that these variants and the genes that they regulate are probably going to be really very interesting targets potentially for the development of new disease-modifying treatments for progressive forms of MS, which, as you and I'm sure most of our viewers today know, is an area of really supreme unmet need.
Well, we heard from Cheryl, who tells us that she's excited to hear about this progress. Cheryl's wondering if people can get tested or screened for these genes.
Yeah, not quite yet, John. So, the information we shared today is sort of looking at large groups of people that may or may not have the variant. It's not clear if this would be informative in an individual person yet, and certainly these are very, very new discovery, new variants that aren't ready to deploy in the clinic yet. But it could, you might imagine, at some point with additional studies and new information that perhaps they could be part of evidence that could help prognosticate the course of disease and potentially guide treatment decisions.
You know, over the years, many studies have reported that low levels of vitamin D are a risk factor for developing MS. This inspired 2 large clinical trials to test whether high doses of vitamin D could reduce ongoing MS disease activity. What can you tell us about these clinical trials?
Right. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of data, a lot of evidence from various sources over decades that are telling us that low serum vitamin D levels are a risk factor for MS. We don't know exactly why, but that observation inspired, as you mentioned, 2 large clinical trials, both of which reported out at the meeting in October. The first one was a study that was performed in the United States. This was a society-funded clinical trial that was conducted by Dr. Ellen Mowry at Johns Hopkins University and her colleagues. And she compared high doses of vitamin D, so 5,000 international units per day, to low doses of vitamin D, that would be 600 international units per day, in people with relapsing remitting MS, and people with relapsing remitting MS that were also taking daily injections of Copaxone. So Copaxone is kind of the baseline, and adding high and low vitamin D in addition to that. So her primary outcome was looking at clinical disease changes at 96 weeks. And she studied this in 140 people and found really conclusively that there was no evidence at all that high dose vitamin D supplements, or either the high or low dose supplements, could reduce the severity of MS, reduce the activity, whether you measured it by MRI or measured it clinically. The second study was performed in Australia and New Zealand. It was funded by the MS Australia Society, and the society provided some additional support as well. And this was conducted by an investigator, Dr. Helmut Butzkoven, and his colleagues. And they looked at multiple doses. So they looked at 1,000, 5,000, and 10,000 international units per day and compared it to placebo. And their trial had included 204 people. Now, a part of where this is a little different from the US study is the subjects had clinically isolated syndrome rather than MS. So clinically isolated syndrome are people that have lesions that look like MS and have had one clinical attack that looks like MS, but haven't had the second attack yet that would push them into the definitively diagnosed with MS. So a very early stage of MS. and because of the people in this trial did not technically have MS, this was placebo controlled. So you got the high, medium, low dose of vitamin D or placebo. So their outcome was after a half a year, after 48 weeks, and the investigators also found no difference. So their outcome was how many people will go on to develop the second clinical attack and develop really clinically definite MS. And they didn't see any differences at all in the number of people in all the treatment arms that went on to develop MS. So I guess my comment, John, that it's disappointing, of course, right, that these were negative. This could have been an inexpensive, disease modifying therapy potentially for people with MS. So that's, of course, the bad news. I think, to me, what's the good news is that these studies were definitive, right? They were well designed, they were well executed. I don't think we need to spend a whole lot more time or resources on testing this question about whether vitamin D supplementation is beneficial for people with ongoing disease.
Depression is a very common MS symptom, affecting 1 out of every 2 people who are living with MS. So I was excited to learn about this next study. This trial treated depression in people with MS using an internet-based cognitive behavioral program. What can you tell us about this study, and what did the results show?
So depression is a really common symptom in people with MS. It's been associated with decreased quality of life, things like absence from work. It's among one of the strongest predictors for suicidal thoughts in people with MS. And depression in MS remains underdiagnosed. It's often untreated or undertreated. And people with MS, in turn, face challenges in attending in-person sessions with a psychotherapist. Sometimes due to their MS symptoms, that people have mobility challenges or cognitive problems or fatigue. And I think, as we all know, trying to get an appointment with a psychotherapist can be really challenging and take forever to get. So there's a real demand to have maybe a virtual online program for people with MS. So this study was performed by Dr. Stefan Gold, who's at the Charité University in Berlin, and a group of international colleagues. And they tested a 12-week online program called Deprexis, a program that can help people create more positive thoughts and behaviors. And this study was also supported by the society. It uses proven counseling techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, similar to what you would get from a therapist or another healthcare provider, but it doesn't require the need to connect with a live person. That's the real advantage. So this study included 279 participants that were enrolled, and they were split into 3 groups. So one group got the online program that was guided by a therapist. One group had just a standalone program without any sort of guidance, and one was you might think of as placebo, or just had the usual treatment. So people in both of those treatment arms, whether it was therapist guided or a standalone program, the treatments were found to be safe, and they significantly reduced depression. They significantly improved the quality of life. What they didn't do was improve fatigue, which I'm not sure is a huge surprise necessarily. I think it's interesting that the benefits were maintained for at least a year. And now, perhaps important to note that this Deprexis, this isn't a panacea. It doesn't completely cure depression, but it could really be a option to consider very early as a very early treatment for depression, or if a person, as we mentioned earlier, for a variety of reasons is unable to access in-person treatment. And so certainly, I think this is the kind of research that will help validate the benefits of this program, and probably a real important step in getting this covered by insurance.
We heard from Jason, who tells us he's thrilled to hear about these results. He says there's a real need for this type of accessible treatment. And Jason's wondering how long it will take for this treatment to be available.
Yeah, well, I can happy to answer that question. I mean, the Deprexis platform program is available online. I looked at it actually right before we got on the call. It's not free though, and so I think I think the challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be about getting insurance to cover this program. And that's an area where we'll be working with the investigators to try to create opportunities to get coverage for insurance for this.
Another really interesting study looked at whether MS can be delayed or even prevented. The participants in this trial all had radiologically isolated syndrome. So first, please explain what radiologically isolated syndrome is, and then tell us what this study was all about.
Sure. So radiologically isolated syndrome, or RIS, is diagnosed when the brain or spinal cord MRI scans that are requested for other reasons, brain trauma or migraine, or just to eliminate people who have had neurological symptoms. And when these brain scans are done, lesions that look like MS are revealed. But the people who have these lesions have had no clinical symptoms that look like MS. So they've got lesions that look a lot like MS, but you can have lesions for a lot of reasons, but these look like MS without any clinical symptoms, and it may be a very, very early stage of MS. So the extent to which people that have RIS are likely to develop diagnosed MS, what are those factors that are linked to a higher risk for converting from RIS to MS? Those factors are unclear. And we also don't know whether potentially could a disease-modifying therapy that's deployed in this very early stage of MS, this RIS stage, could a disease-modifying therapy actually prevent the clinical onset of MS in this group? You and I have talked a lot about that recently. I'm very excited about that possibility. So investigator at UT Southwestern, Dr. Darren Akuda, and with support by Biogen, who gets a lot of credit actually for supporting this study, launched the ARISE phase 4 clinical trial in 2016. And the idea here was to assess whether Tecfidera was superior to placebo at reducing the risk for developing symptoms of MS in this population with RIS. So they recruited, these are not easy people to find. They recruited over several years, 87 adults that were diagnosed with RIS and had an absence of MS symptoms or signs. Most of the participants were kind of on average in their mid-40s, and they were randomly assigned to either get Tecfidera or placebo twice a day for a year. The trial's main goal was, again, to determine the time to the first clinical symptoms of MS. So how long does it take for someone to determine if and when they move on to developing symptoms of MS? And then there were also other things in there, John, like MRI changes, lesion volume, and other sort of secondary and exploratory outcomes. So the results were exciting. They showed that Tecfidera could significantly reduce the risk for a first clinical demyelinating event by 82% compared to placebo. This, if you adjusted for other factors, things like age and the age of diagnosis and sex and family history and things like that, the results were even more profound. Also, the Tecfidera treated participants in the study had lower numbers of new or enlarging lesions than those in the placebo group, as well as those lesions were actually the ones they had were smaller. The therapy, of course, Tecfidera is an approved disease-modifying therapy for MS. The risks and side effects are pretty well known. The therapy was pretty well tolerated. There weren't any unexpected safety concerns or outcomes in the trial. And just super exciting. I mean, this is the first completed trial of its kind we've ever had in RIS. It adds to this concept, this idea that the earlier we treat, the better the outcomes are going to be. And there are, I'm aware of at least one other ongoing clinical trial of Ocrevus in RIS that I'm keeping my eye on.
There were so many really encouraging research outcomes that were shared at this conference. I know we could keep talking all day. Was there any other research that stood out to you that we haven't gotten to yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that comes to mind, John, is, there were there's lots of interest and a lot of studies that were reported out at the meeting related to biomarkers. And I think people have heard that term a lot. Let me define it a little bit. So biomarker really is an objective measure that is an indicator of some type of normal biological process or disease process, and or something that would change in response to some kind of therapeutic intervention. So specifically for people with MS, a biomarker could help determine if someone's responding to therapy in a really quick way, could inform decisions potentially about even changing therapies, could help predict or prognosticate the course of disease or disease severity, and inform treatment decisions at the beginning, right? If you know you were going to, let's say, progress rapidly or have a really aggressive course of disease, you might treat with a more aggressive therapy early on if you knew that ahead of time. Biomarkers could help diagnose MS faster and help increase the accuracy of diagnosis. And really relevant to the study we just talked about, it might have the ability to identify people who are at high risk for MS, which could lead to a very early treatment with, of course, what we saw already, improved outcomes. Perhaps we might get to the point where we could prevent MS from happening in the first place. So this would be quicker. A biomarker would be quicker, cheaper, and could be performed more often in an MRI. Probably wouldn't take the place of an MRI, but kind of enhance what we know, learn from an MRI and a biomarker. So there was a lot of progress about biomarkers that were presented at the ECTRIMS meeting in Amsterdam. I'll talk about just briefly, John, a couple of things that got my eye. So one of the leading biomarkers for MS is called serum neurofilament light chain. People have probably been hearing about NFL. Not lost on me that it's also an acronym for National Football League, where we know a lot of those players that leave a game would likely have elevated serum neurofilament light chain levels in their blood because of all that banging their heads around. What we're learning about this biomarker is, and what it's telling us about MS, and getting closer to a test that maybe could help with treatment decisions. We know that the levels of NFL are elevated during relapses, and we know they correlate with the development of new lesions. Lots of data presented at this meeting and other places that treatment with disease-modifying therapies can lower the levels of NFL. Some things that complicate this biomarker: NFL levels go up as we age. So when we all get to be around 40 or so, the slope on that curve for NFL it gets much steeper. So we have to be able to accommodate that when we're thinking about sort of monitoring this in MS. We know that body mass index affects NFL levels. It's probably related to volume of blood. The bigger you are, the more blood you have, the more dilute the NFL would be. So we have to take that into account. And we know there are other health conditions, things like chronic kidney disease, among others, that can affect the levels of NFL. So that work, in order to be able to use NFL in the clinic to account for some of those complications, is happening now. And as progress is being made, and actually last month at the ECTRIMS meeting, a terrific report on kind of establishing what those normal levels are in different age groups, learning how other health conditions affect their levels. And we're real close, I think, to having an understanding of what those normal levels are, so that we can use it to and be able to identify people who might have abnormal levels at an individual level that would help inform some of these things we talked about. NFL's been pretty far advanced, but there's another emerging biomarker that got a lot of attention at the meeting, and it's called glial fibrillary acidic protein. That's a lot to remember and say. GFAP, or sometimes people say GFAP. So if you hear that, that's what that is. It's a structural protein in brain cells called astrocytes. Astrocytes, astro means star. These are star-shaped cells in your nervous system. And astrocytes are the most abundant cell in your nervous system, and they perform critical support functions for your nervous system. And then when they get damaged, they release this GFAP protein, and levels are higher in people with brain trauma, and they're higher in people with MS. So is data presented at the meeting that showed that blood GFAP levels could complement what we're learning from NFL. And perhaps one day it might be a combination of both of these biomarkers. It could be maybe some ratio of NFL to GFAP, or some combination of them that could really, I think, refine diagnosis, like I said, prognosis, and response to therapy.
Well, thank you for sharing so much new and exciting news with us today. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember?
Yeah, the tough question, the top 3 takeaways. Well, one, I think that there were 7,000 or 8,000 people in Amsterdam in October from around the world that are all making advances in MS research. That despite the pandemic and that got in our way a little bit, that huge progress is being made. And I think, John, appreciating while we could and did gather electronically and remotely during the pandemic, that nothing takes the place of being together in person in one of these meetings. You put 7,000 smart people in a room, you give them opportunities to network and share what they're doing. Only good things can come out of that. And so those conversations in the hallways and in other places are huge. And this was just a reminder that we still need to have these in-person meetings, and just inspired there are so many people that are really pushing progress in MS. I think I'm excited about the pace of innovation and discovery in MS. I mean, we've made more advances in MS research and treatment than any other neurological disease, and that pace is accelerating. We're anxiously awaiting the results from a number of large clinical trials testing new novel approaches to treating MS, both relapsing and progressive forms of MS. So I'm pretty excited about that. And then I guess maybe the third takeaway, John, maybe something we didn't cover and maybe not everyone thinks of, but in addition to all this sort of new discovery, there is a lot of work going into learning more about the current disease modifying therapies, how to use them, what the long-term benefits and risks are and learning from those studies that could lead to novel treatments as well. I think that's another takeaway, that there's still a lot of investment and made into understanding how to use and optimize the current therapies and improve the quality of life for people living with MS. How's that for the top 3?
Well, I think there'd be a tough top 3 to beat, so I'll take it. And I want to thank everyone who submitted questions today. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Bebo.
Thanks, John. Good to be with you.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please be sure to visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups. You'll learn about ways for you to get involved, and you'll hear about upcoming events that are taking place near you. And remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Bebo for joining us today. Remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Bruce Bebo and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.